Hi Isaac, how you doing?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
I'm good.
You asked me earlier, and we wanted to discuss it on Riverside because I thought it'd be an interesting conversation. What were my thoughts on the notion, the meme that had been flying around, that Europe was on its last legs, that Europe was the old man of the world? And I thought it would be interesting to see whether that thought would lead us. Do you have any initial thoughts on it, or should I just say what comes to mind?
My initial thoughts are that I keep seeing this, as you say, a meme of how Europe is failing, Europe is drowning in regulations, the socialists, they're not adapting to this new world. But there's something in the back of my head that always just keeps me from fully believing that. I can't quite intellectually believe that this is the end of Europe. Because Europe historically has gone through a large number of serious disasters, the 30 Years' War or famine, plague, but they have a knack for coming back in a way that other places don't seem to have. So yeah, I just can't quite get on board with this idea that Europe is over, it's finished.
Yeah, I have to say I have the same instinct. It's easy to play along with the idea that Europe is failing, partly because it's such a popular talking point. But I do, and I think Europe is in a very alien situation historically. It hasn't been in a war of a continent scale war in 80 years. And that was a fairly regular occurrence, Second World War, First World War, 30 Years' War, Napoleonic Wars, even things like the Franco-Prussian War, or the Crimean War, which weren't continent-spanning, at least involved other actors, even on the periphery. I mean, I suppose the Franco-Prussian War is the example of that being less the case. It's just two actors. But the Crimean War definitely involved other actors. And that goes back as far as you want. Europe has, since it's had nations, it's had war. And so we're in an alien position now, where we've had two generations, or if it's 80 years, that's, just over 3 generations, demographically, that have lived in peace. They've lived in no war. Sure, there's been a Cold War, and that actually people raised under that very changed. But to the point that I'm trying to make is that I think we feel sort of orphaned historically because of that. You'd usually have some gauge of what you were capable of as a civilization, as a nation. Things are bad and things can get worse, but we can fight and we can stand up and we can pool our men together and we can build bullets and set up muskets and off to war. We can sail, we can march, we can build forts. We don't really have any notion of that anymore. We just don't know what we're capable of. You've spoken before about, I think you've spoken before with St. John on a podcast about the state of weaponry in Europe, whether it's functional or not, how much of it's functional. I something that stuck in my mind that I heard the other day was that the two most capable armies in the world right now are Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
But maybe not in that order, but the point is those are the two most war-ready armies in the world.
Yeah, that is true.
And so when we as Europeans go, oh well, Ukraine's army is doing terribly, or Americans especially, North Americans go, oh, Ukraine's doing terribly, I'd probably bet the Ukrainian army is more competent than the US army right now. Now, they probably don't have as much capability, but they're definitely more war-ready.
Yes. Even mentally, psychologically.
Yeah, I was listening to Douglas Murray recently. He's been to Ukraine several times since 2022, and he's talked to soldiers on a few occasions, and he was there when J.D. Vance and Trump had their interview. Not their interview, their White House meeting that went viral and he was quite depressed by it. He saw it on his social media and was quite depressed by it, and he later noticed that some of the soldiers, as they were scrolling through their Instagram, clips of it had come up, and so he asked one of them, how does that make you feel? And the soldier said, we're advised not to pay much attention to world politics, but the thing that stuck with Douglas Murray was him going, shit happens, I've got a job to do. And then he went on and loaded a bomb on a drone, and, my point there is actually very specific, which is that attitude of, I have work to do, shit happens, is one that you kind of get when things, your place in things. And that soldier knows his place in the war, but also a country knows its place on a continent and on the world stage when it knows what it's capable of. We don't know what we're capable of.
No.
And so it's a lot easier to just believe, we're on the brink of collapse. And there's some truth to that, otherwise it wouldn't ring so painfully. But you're right with the examples you call up. 30 Years' War, plagues, world wars, and we have a way of coming back. Yeah. I always reset to the fact that Europe was built on competition. Europe was what it was because it competed savagely with itself.
Always. All the time.
Always. So, if I'd be more concerned if you told me we were going to have 500 years of nothing but consumerism, I would say, oh, okay, or an over-tourism. I might say, yeah, I think Europe might be gone. At least it would become Las Vegas, become a tourist attraction. But if you're saying, we might have some civil disorder and some neighbours might pick up their weapons again, I go, okay, that's not going to be fun. But then I'm not afraid that Europe will disappear.
No, it's not the end of the world if you have chaos or localized chaos in certain areas. So, for example, France is kind of my favorite topic to discuss in this way. But I can very easily see a future of Europe in which France begins to degrade and begins to fall apart, and the French government is no longer able to extend power to Marseille or to Nice. I can see it being a lot more of a localized government, which would be slightly odd considering that France traditionally was a bit more united than Germany, but Germany might be the country that's more united than France at this point. And so actually, having read so much history, I'm not happy that might be the case. But I have an understanding of, this has happened before. There is a way through this. This is not the end of the world, in the way that, say, over-tourism would be.
Yeah. It's a natural thought to arrive at when what you're looking at is what you're describing, which is if certain countries can't extend control, if the forces of security can't sustain themselves, then it's going to feel like the end of Europe for some people. And to be fair, it's going to be the end of Europe as we know it.
Well, that was my question. Like, what is the definition of Europe? What is... Because the definition I think most of us have of Europe right now is a subservient ally of the Americans who are protected by the American defense environment, and all they need to do is export goods to the US, buy US Treasury bonds, and essentially do what they're told. That's kind of our view of Europe, but rewind 80 years ago, it certainly was not that. Europe was a very, very different beast.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you bring up the point about the US. That's we live in a moment where we actually get to decide what it means to be Europe. Because if it's not what you're describing, if it's not the natural ally of the global superpower called the United States, then what is it? And it seems to me that the bureaucratic answer, or the default answer, that we are falling to because we haven't had that conversation, and I mean on a competitive basis, is, we're an economic union surrounded by other countries that also have relations with that economic union, and an 80-year tradition of diplomacy, commerce, and cooperation. Now, that's not nothing. That's actually incredibly impressive, especially on a historical scale. It's unprecedented, especially when you're dealing with nations like European nations. But when the question is, okay, you've now got to make choices. Like, are you okay with having your biggest trading partner be a authoritarian regime? Like, if China becomes the biggest trading partner, like, do we remain the same definition of ourselves? What does it mean when suddenly peace isn't an option? When the conversation, do we have our own army, territorial army, becomes a how quickly can we get it, and not a should we have it? I'm just asking questions because I don't actually know the immediate answer to that. To my bias, I think it defaults to something like Sinjun was describing in another conversation that I had with him, that Europe is, a historical definition, is those who wrestle with Christ. Those who wrestle with the God who is Christ. But that's not enough anymore, because there's other Christian countries, and there's a lot of Europe is no longer those who wrestle with Christ. A lot of its population is no longer those who wrestle with Christ.
That is true.
So what do you do? I mean, the obvious historical answer is something will emerge, or several things will emerge, and then you'll have a divided continent on more lines than just borders, on ideological, ethnic, religious.
I get the sense for Europe that nationality will not be as important.
Interesting. What makes you think that?
So nationality is actually quite a new concept. The first kind of nationalist state within Europe was Napoleonic France. And it was a mechanism by which Napoleon was able to convince, or revolutionaries were able to convince average citizens to defend the new republic, and then Napoleon repurposed this. And so this idea of national identity, that's a very, very new thing that developed all the way through the 19th century and then up into the 20th century. It culminated in the Second World War, I would argue. But it's actually quite new. So previously, your identity was tied to your village, it was tied to your feudal lord, it was tied to who you interacted with pretty much on a daily basis in a very, very close circumference. You didn't really go outside of your village, and if you did, or your town, and if you did, it was very dangerous. You took a long time to get anywhere, and you had armed guards with you. And so this idea of identity, national identity, is, I think that might be one of the first things to go. And I can say it certainly from my point of view that I can tell amongst people of our age that a sense of national identity is not that important to us. It's important to the Americans, I think, but a lot less so to European people in the 20s and 30s. There are other things which are a bit more important, and increasingly that can be political views, or that's your views on your family, your local area. There's a lot of talk about local communities right now. And so I'm not sure exactly how to put it into words, but national identity as a concept, I think, is starting to fade increasingly.
No, that's very compelling. You're making me reflect on conversations I've had with people when I've lived in different European countries. Because that is, I think you're right. I've had conversations with people our age, and I've mentioned nationality to them. And I've mentioned perceiving their nationality as a foreigner. I have described that among young people it's kind of gone. They don't really feel, whether it's French when I was in France, or English when I was in England, or Scottish. No, there are definitely people that feel Scottish. Whatever that means. But again, that's also very local. Scotland's a small place.
Yeah.
Compared to other countries.
National identities, I think, are declining. What I think is increasing is perhaps regional identities, and I would argue that Scotland probably falls into the category of a regional identity. English falls into the category of a regional identity.
Okay.
And you can see that here in Germany, people don't. I mean, I've said this to you before. People don't leave their local areas that much, and so there's this sense of regional identity, which is actually closer to like, I don't leave my town, I don't leave my village, like you get a few hundred years ago in Europe. There's a much greater sense of regional identity, and you can see that in our discussions about Valencia and the city. It's not necessarily Spain, it's possibly Valencia. There's room for discussion along these themes, and I would say that the room for that discussion is new. 15, 20 years ago, I don't think people were talking about regional identities in such the same way. And that doesn't mean they're necessarily more important or better than national identities, but I think that the sense of connection with your regional identity has grown.
I think I have a feeling you're right, Isaac. We were just before our conversation now, we were talking about an article you were writing for Catalyst. And we were talking about networks and financial power attracting political power, and how networks and organizations fall into or attract political power because of the economic power they sort of leverage. Networks do that. If you have a functional network, you have an economy that scales. I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, it just makes sense, wouldn't it? I'm just thinking on a purely, you're on a game board, and things are breaking down and social cohesion is diminishing. You return to the local area, and you build networks there, and you build economies there, and those scale, but they have a core. And so regionalism fits that. But that doesn't, I have a strange suspicion that religiosity might start mattering more. That doesn't really fit that bill, though it is actually, to your own definition of what a network is, or has to have a functional network, is something that they hold sacred in common. So that's where that comes in. So what we're painting right now, the picture that we're painting, just from what we've read, what we've discussed, you and I, of what Europe looks like in response to this meme of collapse, is something like regionalism, competition, and the disappearance of nationalism as we know it.
I have to go in a second, but I think the best illustration of what Europe might look like in 50 years is if you look at a map of Europe from 1500. Because when people talk about, the meme of make America states again, what they think of is Texas, this big state having all this power and, okay, break down the EU and then you get national states again. No, the end result of regionalism is tiny states that are a city and a few hundred square kilometers. That is the reality of where I think we might head.
That's a different picture.
It is. Look at a map from 1500 in Europe. It's interesting.
I will. Actually, I think I might put that up as the end of this episode.
Yeah.
On screen. Ponder that, viewer.
I unfortunately need to go.
Yes, likewise.
But yeah, nice to chat.
Lovely to talk to you, Isaac.
Yeah, great to chat.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for posing the question. Take care of yourself.
You too. Chat.